Hey, baby!
JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is my favorite anime series of all time. There are not enough words to describe how invigorated and hyped up I am watching the show. As such, I wanted to do a quick review of each part of JoJo and what we have to look forward to in the near future. Part 1 is arguably the most overhated JoJo part. It has gotten a reputation for the part that is usually skipped or tabbed out from most people in my social circles. For me though, Part 1 is critical for one's love and appreciation of JoJo, at least for the first 3 parts. Part 1 introduces us to the most iconic anime villains of all time, Dio. Dio is the epitome of an unredeemable villain who at all turns causes chaos and destruction. Without his impact on the series, it would hardly feel the same, but that is saying a lot given how strong Pucci, Diavolo, Cars, and Kira are as villains. I would argue that Dio's impact as a villain is around the same as Griffith. They are downright deplorable characters, but each respective fandom loves them. You can see why in Part 1, as Dio can be best described as a highly intelligent sociopath. He has charisma, intelligence, strength, and God forbid, even luck. His stats are godlike in comparison to any other villain in the series. Why is Dio like this, some of you may be asking? Well, it all starts at the beginning of Part 1 with ugly bastard Dojin protag Dario Brando trying to rob the Joestars after a terrible carriage accident in 1868. Dario Brando unintentionally saves George Joestar's life, gaining a favor out of the rich noble. As such, George funds a business venture of Dario's, a hotel that fails miserably. Soon after, the real events of Phantom Blood unfold, with Dario Brando sending a letter to George Joestar asking for him to take care of his son, Dio, as Dario was dying. We soon learned that it was Dio who was poisoning his own father in order to force his way into the upper echelons of society, but more on that later. From the very moment Dio is on screen, he exudes charm and wit that rivals Jonathan's at every step. Jonathan is a good protagonist, but he's heavily carried by a superior antagonist. The two clash at every moment, with Dio using his intelligence to gaslight George Joestar into berating his own son. The setup of this part is my second in the series, as it is a Victorian vampire drama heavily inspired by the Phantom of the Opera, hence why it is called Phantom Blood. Araki's love for Western media and manga in general oozes through the pages of JoJo, as they are very clear homages to things he enjoys himself. Phantom Blood is also important to me because it is an anomaly from a storytelling perspective. It has not 1, not 2, but 3 central climaxes. Speaking of climaxes, Jonathan and Dio continue to clash with each other, but the thing that separates the two of them is their empathy. Jonathan is your typical protagonist, a courageous and strong individual who wants to protect those that are weaker than him, whereas Dio is someone who looks down on those he deems beneath him. The best comparison I can make is that they are eerily similar to Thor and Loki, with Dio having used his charm and wit to deceive others, and Jonathan being someone with a clear moral compass and strength to boot. Dio is a byproduct of the alcoholism that his father suffered from, something that he even suffers from as a young adult. But even still, he works to try and overcome this and become a better person. And what I mean by Dio trying to improve himself, I really mean the fact that he's trying to break the cycle of alcoholism in his family and the cycle of poverty. The story is not only about humanity, but breaking cycles and traditions that happen inside of family circles, like cycles of abuse or cycles of alcoholism. The same can be said about Jonathan, who wants to learn to become a better man and gentleman. Despite his upper class standing, Jonathan doesn't look down on others, something that Dio actually does even though he was raised poor. So if anything, it's also talking about nature versus nurture. Most of the Joestars aren't the most intelligent folk. If anything, they're predominantly himbos who are morally good to a T. With that being said, some of George's actions can be understood, as it is revealed that George Joestar knew that Dario Brando was trying to rob him. He even cites letting Dario go after the police inform him that he's trying to sell his wife's stolen wedding ring. He's a better man than I am. It is important to know that this animosity between Dio and Jonathan is constant, but their first conflict begins when the two of them get into a fistfight. Jonathan overpowers Dio, which enrages him, and as a result, Dio murders Jonathan's dog. In the most cruel and inhumane way possible, Dio burns Danny alive in the incinerator. With this loss, Dio decides to bide his time and get physically stronger. At the same time, Jonathan realizes that he must become a gentleman, and he tries to grow in the areas that he's not strong in. This is why Jonathan and Dio work together as a protagonist and antagonist, because they complement each other perfectly. What the other possesses, the other one lacks, and as such they must work to obtain it. This is the first central climax of the show, and goes to show how Araki can flex his writing muscles. The thing that separates Jonathan from all the other Joestars in my eyes is that there is a very specific focus on romance in Phantom Blood. Erina Pendleton is a maiden of the highest regard. We can see that as she tries to wash her mouth after Dio kisses her. On all accounts, Erina was someone who exuded the highest amount of moral fiber. She's a devoted partner and is the reason that Jonathan goes from a brutish man to a gentleman, as Jonathan asked her to teach him how to do so. The only light in Jonathan's current nothingness, but after Dio forcefully kisses her, she soon leaves England, leaving Jonathan all alone. Jonathan is now on a path of self-improvement, and he has to do so in order to compete with Dio. This is because they're now vying for the Joestar fortune. We fast forward 7 years where George Joestar is sick in a way that was eerily similar to the sickness that Dario Brando had before he died. I wonder why that is. Jonathan soon learns that Dio has been poisoning his father, George. Jonathan goes to Ogre Street to try and find some proof of this, as well as an antidote for the poison. Jonathan meets Speedwagon and the two fight each other. Jonathan spares the lives of Speedwagon and his fellow gang members, which spurs the fighter spirit within him. Speedwagon proceeds to stop his fight against Jonathan and instead work with him. Speedwagon then helps him find the antidote that Jonathan needs for George and essentially becomes Jonathan's bodyguard. At the same time, Dio is also at Ogre Street. He is here to try and murder Jonathan so that his plot is not uncovered. With this, Dio fucks up and turns a drunk man into a powerful vampire who nearly kills Dio himself before ultimately being saved by the sunlight. Dio now fully understands the power of the mask though, and with it, the second climax of the story happens. After George is cured, he comes to his senses and arranges for the constables to come and arrest Dio. With his back against the wall, Dio uses the stone mask, trying to stab Jonathan. Instead, George jumps in front of his son and protects him, dying in the process. With this, Dio awakens the power within the stone mask and puts it on himself. The stone mask transforms Dio into a vampire. Seeing this, Jonathan sets the Joestar Manor on fire, trying to imprison Dio in a tomb of fire. Somehow, Dio survives though, and with his newfound power, he plots to get his revenge on Jonathan. After surviving the fight with a newly turned vampire Dio, Jonathan is reunited with Erina Pendleton, who treats his wounds. Shortly after, they take a walk together and they encounter Will A. Zeppeli. He is someone who has vowed to destroy the stone mask as it caused his father's death. Again, this is where Rocky flexes his writing muscles, as he knows it is important to unite the student and the master under a tragedy that impacted them both. They both lost their fathers to this mask, so they're obviously going to forge a strong bond over that. Zeppeli becomes Jonathan's Mr. Miyagi, and he teaches him how to use supernatural energy by controlling his breathing. This is known as Hamon, and this is the power used by the Joestars in both Part 1 and Part 2. After Part 3 though, Hamon is phased out for stands as they are more memorable. Hamon does come back in a similar way though in Steel Ball Run, known then as Spin. Back to Phantom Blood though. Jonathan, Speedwagon, and Zeppeli must now fight an army of zombies that have been created by Dio. At this point it is important to disclose very briefly that Araki pays tributes to music and other media that he likes by naming them central characters or stands. That is true in the case of Dio, who is named after the lead vocalist of Black Sabbath and Dio, the late Ronnie James Dio. Also, the word Dio itself means God in Italian. You can see the clear jump that's being made here, with Dio himself thinking he is now a god after being turned into a vampire. The homages do not stop with Dio though in Phantom Blood, with Speedwagon being named after the band of the same name. Zeppeli is an homage to Led Zeppelin. Dyer and Strazo are also an homage, with their names combined to make the band Dire Straits. There are plenty of other homages, but those are some of the most prevalent ones in Phantom Blood. Back to Jonathan and the gang though. During the fight with the zombies, Zeppeli is struck down by Tarkus. In his dying breath, Zeppeli gives his Hamon energy to Jonathan. This death of a Zeppeli in the arms of a Joestar is something that would be mirrored within Part 2 as well. Again, everything Araki does is for some brilliant writing reason. After Jonathan fights his way to Dio, they start their final battle. It's a back and forth, but eventually Dio has to concede defeat, and he cuts his own head off to survive a full-blown Hamon attack. This seems like your typical happily ever after, with Jonathan marrying Erina and heading off to America for their honeymoon. A somehow still alive Dio had other plans for this though. Dio is under the impression that the reason he has lost is the result of the genetics, and that he must have Jonathan's body in order to become the supreme being he believes he is. This is something that has been alluded to throughout all of Phantom Blood, with Jonathan having the physical advantage but Dio having the mental one. Dio mortally wounds Jonathan, and Dio is moments from getting what he ultimately wants before Jonathan uses the last of his Hamon to force Dio's servant, Wang Chan, into forcing the ship to explode. With death all but certain for him, Jonathan holds onto Dio's head in his arms, clutching onto him and preventing him from escaping. The two presumably die in the coffin that Dio snuck onto the ship with and sank to the bottom of the ocean. A somehow still alive Erina vows to pass on the truth of Jonathan's life to her unborn child in generations to follow, and we are left on a cliffhanger as to what the next generation of JoJo's will do. This concludes Phantom Blood, and I can't help but think that Araki is a fucking genius for what he did with it. It is by far one of the most underrated parts of JoJo, and for sure the most overhated. Its themes of humanity and preserving through it all is something that I am in awe of. If you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend you do and start the series, or even give it a rewatch if you haven't seen it in a while. You might just come out of your viewing humbly surprised. Tune in next time for when we talk about Part 2, Battle Tendency.